Maigret and the Spinster by George Simenon. Part 3, Chapter 3.
Where have you come from? Vanya, Chief Superintendent. You could catch the 5-7 train back, unless you'd prefer to spend the night in Paris. Let's have your expense sheets, boys. Maigret stopped the taxi on the corner of Rue Lafayette. It was such a squally day that people were having difficulty in holding their umbrellas upright. At the sight of a taxi full of police, the passers-by stopped instead. The chief superintendent spread the expense sheets on his knee and signed them. The two policemen got out and disappeared into a bar. Maigret slid back the glass panel and, in an undertone, murmured something to the driver. Then, as soon as the taxi was in motion again, he took a small key from his pocket and relieved Gerhard Pardon of his handcuffs. I expect you to behave yourself, if you don't mind. A few dozen blameless citizens like you, and we would have to treble the personnel of the police judiciaire. Gerhard gave a start. He had been gazing out at the streets of Paris as if he had not set eyes on them for years. Now he turned his permanently mistrustful gaze upon the chief superintendent. What makes you say blameless? Maigret had difficulty in suppressing a smile. You're surely not telling me that you are guilty. If you believed I was innocent, why did you have me arrested? If you really are innocent, why did you run away? Why did you bolt like a frightened horse at the sight of a couple of policemen? And why did you go to ground in a little cubby hole which could hardly have been conducive to comfort? Spencer Oats, leaning back in his seat, was blissfully digesting his lunch. He was smiling faintly, as people do when, after a good dinner, they are sitting in a theatre, indulgently watching the twists and turns of an exciting play. The light inside the taxi was greenish, as though filtered through the frosted glass panes of a lantern. Through the cab windows, everything looked distorted, the people, the buildings, and umbrellas colliding at strange angles. Sometimes, when the traffic was held up, they could see a bus, with all its passengers in frozen attitudes like waxworks. Look, my boy, I know who killed your aunt. Not really. I know who killed your aunt, and I will prove it to you shortly. It's impossible, protested Gerhard stubbornly, shaking his head. No one could possibly know. Except you, do you mean? And yet I am as sure as I am of anything that you slept through it all. This really did shake Cecile's brother. He looked at Maigret in horrified amazement, as if he could not believe his ears. There, you see. But where are we going? Everything was shrouded in a Scotch mist, and Pardon had only just realized that they were near Place de la Bastille. The driver was approaching Place des Vosges by way of Rue Saint-Antoine. Now, just you listen to me. There is a reward of 20,000 francs for information leading to the apprehension of the killer. For reasons which don't concern you, the police judiciaire want no part of that money. But you must know that Just you keep your mouth shut. To the best of my knowledge, your wife is still at home, and your sister Bertha is with her. As you appear to have some objection to the maternity ward, here is something on account, which you can set against the 20,000 francs you will be receiving shortly. Go on up. Be as quick as you can. We'll wait for you in the cab. What clinic did you have in mind when you asked Cecile for the money? St. Joseph's. Very well. Bertha can take your wife there now, and you can join them later on. The American looked from one to the other in some bewilderment. Don't do anything foolish now. The taxi had stopped, but Gerhard, dazed and perhaps still a little mistrustful, hesitated. Be off with you, you silly fool. For the next 10 minutes, Maigret smoked his pipe in silence, and when presently Pardon reappeared, wiping his eyes, he merely exchanged glances with Spencer Oats. Quel est ce verve, driver? By the way, Gerhard, when did you last have anything to eat? There he gave me a sandwich on the train. But really, I'm not hungry. I am thirsty, though. He was so overcome that he could hardly speak. They stopped once again outside a bar. Maigret was thankful for the chance to order a glass of beer to help him digest the coq au vin, not to mention the coffee cream cake. 10 minutes later, he was stuffing his stove with all the fuel it could take. After he had lit it and switched on the green-shaded table lamp on his desk, he said to Gerhard, "Sit down. Take off your raincoat. It's soaking. Come nearer the fire. Your trousers will soon be dry. You must have been out of your mind to get yourself into such a state." It was not yet quite dark. Through the window could be seen strings of faintly glimmering lights all along the banks of the Seine. It was the busiest time of the day at police headquarters. Doors could be heard opening and shutting. Footsteps hurried to and fro in the corridor. Telephones rang. Typewriters chattered. "Torrence, that list you made out for me of all visitors to this building on the morning of the 7th of October. Bring it here, will you?" At long last, Maigret sat down, picked up the biggest of the many pipes ranged on his desk, and began. "What did you have to drink that night at your aunt's apartment? Wait, let me help you. You were at the end of your tether, weren't you? You knew that your child was due any moment, and you hadn't so much as a stitch of clothing for it. You were in the habit of going to your sister Cécile for money. Come now, you needn't look so sheepish." Unfortunately, Cécile hadn't much to give, only what she could save out of the housekeeping, and her allowance was far from generous. As a rule, you waited for your sister outside in the street, but that night you went upstairs and let yourself into the apartment. You hid in Cécile's bedroom while she was elsewhere attending to Madame Boynet. Am I right so far? Quite right. When your aunt was settled at the dining room table and ready for her dinner, Cécile went into the kitchen. You opened the bedroom door and told her that you had to have some money at all costs. I told her I was at the end of my tether, and rather than see my wife. Right. Not only did you play on Cécile's sympathy, you went further. You frightened her. It was a sort of emotional blackmail. I had made up my mind to kill myself. After having killed your wife. Idiot. I swear to you, Chief Superintendent, I would have done it. For 3 whole days before that, Shut up. Your sister couldn't discuss the matter with you then, in case the old woman should overhear. She served the meal as usual. She ate with her aunt. No doubt she asked the old woman for the money, and was refused. By the time Madame Boynet was safely in bed, I presume she did go to bed. It was too late for you to leave the house, as by that time the street door was locked. You would have had to ask the concierge to let you out, and she might have reported it to her employer. Presumably, Cécile brought food to you in the bedroom. What did you have to eat? Bread and cheese. Did you have anything to drink? A glass of wine to start with. Anything else? Cécile always had a cup of herb tea at night because she had a delicate stomach. There was a full cup there ready for her. She suggested that I should drink it. I had been trying. I was feeling very low, and I thought I was going to be sick. And Cécile gave up her bed to you. Yes, we talked a little while longer about Eileen. Then I can't think why I fell asleep. Maigret looked at the American as if to say, I told you so. You fell asleep because you drank the herb tea intended for your sister, to which your aunt, as always when she was expecting a visit from Monsieur Charles, had added a massive dose of bromide. Everything that followed occurred as a result of this seemingly trivial mischance. If Cécile had drunk the herb tea as intended, your aunt would almost certainly still be alive, in which case your sister. Maigret got up and went to the window. He stood there with his back to the room and murmured, as if to himself, Cécile, having given up her bed to you, sits in an armchair. She can't sleep, and for a very good reason. Old Madame Boynet, as the appointed time approaches, gets up, puts on her dressing gown and stockings, and, confident that there is no one to hear her, goes to the door to wait for Monsieur Charles. It was all because you were feeling sick, and therefore drank the herb tea intended for Cécile, that the two schemers... What do you mean by that? Exclaimed the young man, turning pale. Isn't that what they were? Come now, let me finish. It's getting very hot in here. He went across and opened the door leading to another office. As I was saying, the two schemers are in the sitting room, which is lit only by a single table lamp. Cécile, hearing noises, creeps into the passage or the dining room and listens unseen. They talk in low voices of their unsavory business affairs. about the house in Béziers, and the one on Rue d'Antin. I can just imagine poor Cecile's face when, at long last, it dawned on her what sort of places they were. Monsieur Charles hands over the 50,000 francs to his former mistress. She relocks the bureau, but retains the money in her hand. She sees the former lawyer to the door and bolts it behind him. Breathing a sigh of satisfaction, she returns to her bedroom. A good night's work, a substantial addition to her savings. She raises the lid of the tapestry stool which she uses as a strong-box, and Cecile, her eye glued to the keyhole, sees the thick bundles of 1,000-franc bills. As for you, you are still sound asleep. Were you awakened by any untoward sounds? Think carefully now. No, it was my sister who... Hold on, your aunt is undressing. She has already taken off one stocking when Cecile, driven frantic by your threats of suicide. I couldn't have foreseen, wailed Gerhard. That's what they always say afterward, but be that as it may, your sister bursts into the room, much to the alarm of the old woman. The sight of all that money, a fortune no less, gives Cecile courage. She repeats her request for money. She is not pleading now, she is almost threatening. What neither of the two women suspects is that in the apartment below, Monsieur Charles is listening in astonishment and alarm to every word they say. I can guess your aunt's reaction. No doubt her tongue lashed her niece, whom she considered to be so much in her debt, and reminded her yet again of all she had done for her and her family. Possibly she may even have threatened to call for help. It wasn't quite like that, said the young man slowly. In that case, you tell me. I don't know exactly what time it was. I heard someone calling my name over and over again. Waking up was a struggle, and I couldn't make out what was going on. I felt dazed, as if I'd had too much to drink. Cecile was sitting on the edge of the bed. Gerhard, she shouted. Gerhard, what's wrong with you? You've got to listen to me. She was very composed, more so than usual. I thought she must be ill. She was so pale and she had such dark rings under her eyes. She spoke softly, but distinctly. Gerhard, Aunt Juliette is dead. I've just killed her. And then she sat quite still for ages, just staring at the floor. I got out of bed, intending to go and see for myself. Don't move. You mustn't on any account. She didn't want your fingerprints to be found there, murmured Maigret. He was thinking of Cecile, impassive, waiting for him for hours on end in the aquarium. That's what she told me. She described it all to me. Aunt Juliette was sitting on the edge of the bed. She must have heard something, because she felt under her pillow for the revolver she always kept there at night. She was scared stiff of burglars. Oh, it's you, she said, on seeing Cecile. Why aren't you asleep? I suppose you've been spying on me. Listen, Aunt, earlier tonight, I asked you for a little money for Gerhard, or rather for his wife, who is expecting a baby. Go back to bed. You're a rich woman. I know that now. You've got to listen to me. Gerhard will kill himself if... Is that good-for-nothing brother of yours here? My aunt, still holding the revolver, tried to stand up. Cecile was so scared, she went up to her and seized her by the arm. You've got to give me some money. Aunt Juliette fell back on the bed. She struggled to reach the revolver, which had slipped out of her hand, and it was then that my sister seized her by the throat. In cold blood, Maigret's voice rang out with unwonted resonance. Yes, he had been wrong. There had been no commotion. Cecile had not lost her head. If ever there was a sheep in human form, it had been Cecile. For years and years, she had been submissive without even realizing it. Meekness came to her so naturally. It had not taken much, just the sight of that pile of bills, to make her realize the extent to which her aunt had duped and exploited her. Go on, my boy. For a long time, we sat in silence. At one point, Cecile left me, to make sure that Aunt Juliette was really dead. When at last she did speak, it was to say, the police will have to be told. In Maigret's office, too, there was a long silence. The grey dusk was pierced only by the green-shaded desk-light, which revealed the features of the two men in sharp relief. The only sound was the sputter of a pipe. Maigret could picture the brother and sister together in the apartment, in that great house abutting on the Rue Nationale, overwhelmed and utterly stunned by what had happened, and in the apartment below, Monsieur Charles, panic-stricken, able to hear everything, even the faintest whisper. If I were to go up now... And Cécile, looking thoughtfully at her brother, the police were never going to believe that he had taken no part in the murder. Both were sick at heart, and as exhausted as if they had been running for hours. Should she try and get him out of the house? But that would mean asking the concierge to release the catch, and she would be bound to look out through the spy hole to see who it was leaving the house at this late hour. The brother and sister started as all the clocks in the apartment chimed the hour. Listen, Gerhard, I'll go and see Chief Superintendent Maigret first thing in the morning. I'll tell him everything. And while the concierge is out in the yard collecting the garbage cans, you can safely slip out of here and go home. A strange vigil, indeed. They were utterly cut off from the rest of the world. Their plight conjured up a picture of refugees squatting on the ground, surrounded by bundles, in station waiting rooms or on board ship. Which one of you, inquired Maigret, relighting his pipe, thought of the idea of opening the desk and examining the papers? It was Cécile, but that was much later. She had just made coffee for the two of us. I was still pretty dazed. We were sitting in the kitchen, and she suddenly whispered, "Supposing that man should come back." And she went on, "Well, I did tell the chief superintendent that someone had been coming up to the apartment at night, but he wouldn't believe me, and now..." Maigret stared at the unadorned rectangle of the window and bit on the stem of his pipe. Heaven knows what he may do while we were out. Whereupon Cécile had calmly suggested removing the papers from the desk. It had never crossed her mind to take the money and run, or even to give some of it to her brother in his dire need. "Did you look through the papers yourself?" asked the chief superintendent. "Yes." At this point, Maigret got up and went across to the door of the little side office, which she had already pushed open a few minutes before. "I think you had better join us in here, Monsieur Dandurand. What we are about to discuss chiefly concerns you." For it was none other than Monsieur Charles installed in the adjoining office under the watchful eye of an inspector. He cut rather a sorry figure, stripped of his collar and tie and even his shoelaces. He had not shaved for 2 days. His hands hung down in front of him, joined at the wrists by handcuffs. "I'm afraid I can't offer you a chair. I'm sorry. You must be very tired." Gerhard sprang to his feet, suspecting a trap. "What on earth?" "Calm down, pardon. Carry on with what you were saying. I want Monsieur Dandurand to hear your story. You had reached a point where you and your sister were together in the sitting room, looking through the papers in your aunt's desk. Mostly, I imagine, they related to money matters. Bills, receipts, accounts, and that sort of thing. But there were some letters as well." As he said this, Gerhard stole a glance at the former lawyer, as if fearful, in spite of the handcuffs, that he might assault him. "Love letters, were they not?" At this, the former lawyer intervened. "One moment. May I ask if this is by way of being a confrontation?" "You might call it that, Monsieur Dandurand." "In that case, I should be obliged if you would permit me to call my lawyer. Indeed, I insist. It is my right under the law. What is your lawyer's name?" "Maître Planchat." Torrence, shouted Maigret. "Call Maître Planchat, will you? One moment, though. At this hour, I should think he must be in court." "He is in court 11, interposed Monsieur Charles. "Go across to court 11 and bring him here. If his case is still in progress, tell him to ask for an adjournment, at my request." For the next half hour or so, complete silence reigned in Maigret's office, during which time the slightest movement was as audible as the plop of a pebble in the pond. "Take a seat, Maître Planchat. I had better tell you frankly at the outset that it is my present intention to apply to the examining magistrate for a warrant for the arrest of your client on a charge of premeditated murder. Pay attention, pardon. Just now you referred a certain love letters. If I am not mistaken, these letters date back some 15 years. "I don't know. None of them was dated." The lawyer smiled triumphantly and seemed on the point of adopting a tone of forensic belligerency. But Maigret forestalled him by addressing himself to Spencer Oats. "You recall our visit to the ugly little town hall in Berger." Then, turning to Gerhard, "What was in those letters?" No, wait. We'd better get one important point clear first. Am I right in thinking that your sister took the letters so seriously that she made up her mind to hand them over to me when she came here, to police headquarters, to give herself up? She put them in her bag, did she not, along with all the other papers from the desk? Yes. In that case, interposed the lawyer, turning to Maigret, I'd be obliged if you would produce these documents. Let us take our time, Maître. At this, Maigret noted, an ambiguous smile played about Monsieur Charles' lips. You're not out of the wood yet, Dandurand. Oh, I'm well aware that those all too compromising letters fell into your hands, and that you destroyed them. But don't forget that, while I was engaged on the telephone in your apartment, you seized the opportunity to go upstairs and into Madame Boynet's bedroom. Now then, Gerhard, let's have the rest of your story. First of all, tell us how the writer of the letters addressed the recipient. They all began, my darling. It seemed all of a sudden as if Maigret was enjoying himself. Sorry to interrupt you again, but I feel I owe an explanation to my American colleague. I shouldn't like him to get any wrong ideas about how love affairs are conducted in France, and I would therefore wish to point out that, when those letters were written, Madame Boynet was 15 years younger. Even though she was no longer in the first flush of youth, she was, nevertheless, a very different person from the dreadful old fright hobbling on a cane that she was to become in her later years. How many letters were there, Gerhard? About 30. Most of them were just notes. Tomorrow at 3, usual place, love and kisses, yours. Any signature? They were all signed C. Monsieur Charles, who had not been invited to sit down, never took his eyes off the young man. His face was ashen, but he was still very much in command of himself. A mere initial doesn't prove anything, objected Maître Ponchard. If these letters are produced in evidence, I shall enlist the services of a handwriting expert. They will not be produced in evidence, at least not those letters. Go on, Gerhard. Some of the letters were longer, were they not? There were 4 or 5 that were. Tell us about them. In one of them, I remember he wrote, Be brave, remember, your deliverance is at hand, and in a few weeks' time we shall have peace at last. Maître Ponchard sniggered. Are you suggesting that she was pregnant? No, sir. I am suggesting that here was a woman with 2 men in her power, her husband and her lover. This letter was written by her lover. Was her husband ill? Is that what you are saying? That's what we shall have to find out. Go on, my boy. And Gerhard, uncomfortably aware that he was the focus of all eyes, stammered. In another letter he wrote, You see, he doesn't suspect a thing. Be patient. I think it would be wiser for us not to meet for the time being. On the present dose, there will be a delay of at least a fortnight. It would be too risky to attempt to hasten the outcome. I don't understand, exclaimed the lawyer with a little cough. That's just too bad, Maître. And besides, I'm still waiting for you to produce the documents under discussion. Permit me to say that I consider it most unwise of you to proceed on the basis. Whereupon Maigret, very bland and suave, broke in. If you insist, I'm prepared to order the exhumation of the late Juliette Boynet and institute tests on what remains of him after 15 years. You are no doubt aware, Madam, that most poisons, especially poisons such as arsenic, which can be administered in very small quantities, leave traces which remain in the body for a very long time after. He was interrupted by Torrence, with the list he had asked for of everyone who had visited police headquarters on the morning of Cecile's murder.
Squally, adjective, of weather, characterized by squalls. Conducive, adjective, making a certain situation or outcome likely or possible. Untoward, adjective, unexpected and inappropriate or inconvenient. Maigret and the Spinster by George Simenon. Part 3, Chapter 4.
You must be tired of standing, Dandurand. Torrence, bring in another chair. Monsieur Charles is looking a bit shaky. You are mistaken, Chief Superintendent. I'm still waiting for you to produce so much as a shred of evidence. Give me a chance. In view of the fact that your legal advisor, Maître Blanchard, never met old Juliette, I feel it only right that I should give him a brief description of the lady. Don't you agree, Maître Blanchard? The lawyer assented with a slight nod and lit a cigarette. Juliette Casanov, as she then was, growing up in the township of Fontenay-le-Comte, became Dandurand's mistress at a very early age. It created quite a scandal locally. Monsieur Dandurand, at that time, did not yet have any convictions for the corruption of minors. He was very much younger in those days, and not unattractive, I assume. All the same, when the opportunity of making a good match presented itself in the person of Joseph Boynet, Juliette, the child of impoverished parents, didn't hesitate. She even went so far as to sacrifice her sister by appropriating her dowry to add to her own. What sort of life did she envisage for herself in Paris as the wife of a prosperous building contractor? Who can tell? She went to live in Berger, a jealous husband, a dull existence, certainly not luxurious. Years passed. Back in Fontenay, her former lover, Monsieur Dandurand, grew older but did not outgrow his taste for young girls, which later developed into a passion for very young girls. But we don't go into that, if you don't mind. A 2-year prison sentence, nothing much really. And then one fine day, he turns up in Paris, in furnished rooms on Rue de l'Ombre, debarred forever not only from his own profession but from respectable society as a whole. Where did they meet again? It doesn't matter. Suffice it to say that they became lovers once more, and before long the husband was getting in their way. In Juliette's way especially, I'm quite sure of that. It may even have been her idea to get rid of the husband who stood in the way of her freedom. That she sought and obtained the advice of her lover we know from his letters. Letters which I challenge you to produce, interrupted the lawyer, making a show of referring to his papers. Letters which I shall not produce, because on their account your client was driven to commit a second murder, and that's a fact. In that case, a broad sweep of the arm. The lawyer had perhaps forgotten that he was not in the courtroom, wearing his black gown with its billowing sleeves. Patience, my dear Maître. The husband dies at last. The husband is dead. He was given to overeating, heavy drinking, and overwork. His doctor is easily persuaded that the cause of death is a heart attack. And it was at this point, he paused, turning first to Monsieur Charles, then to Spencer Oats, his eyes alight with mischief. And it was at this point that our friend Juliette turned overnight into the crazy old woman of her later years. Possibly she was still attracted to the man who had been her accomplice, but she was so afraid of him, she became deeply suspicious of everything, because she now knew how easy it was to take a life. She became a miser. Monsieur Charles went to live in her house, occupying the apartment just below hers, but she had become jealous of her reputation and would only meet him outside. Then, out of the blue, 2 nieces and a nephew fell into her lap. Later, on account of her infirmities, she ceased to be able to go out, and in order to confer in safety with her accomplice at night, she took the precaution of drugging Cecile with bromide. If Cecile had not had a weak stomach, if she had not been in the habit of drinking herb tea every night, God knows. Madame Boynet had kept those old letters safely locked up in her desk in the sitting room. Dandurand had put her in the way of a number of highly profitable, even though unsavory investments. She, who had once been a passionate lover, was now old, miserly, and helpless. As illicit relationships go, this was a particularly odious one. The nephew and one of the nieces had escaped, and good riddance to them. Only poor Cecile, endowed with the temperament of a slave or a saint, stuck it out. Permit me to ask you a question, Chief Superintendent, put in the lawyer. What are your grounds for? I'll tell you later, Maître. In the meantime, I would appreciate your attention for a little while longer. Love had turned to avarice. One passion had been superseded by another because, as every blacksmith knows, it takes a nail to knock out a nail. It took only the merest mischance, the trivial accident whereby Gerhard drank the herb tea intended for Cecile, for the situation to explode into tragedy. Dandurand, downstairs in his apartment, hears every word. He knows that up there now there are two people who have just learned the whole truth. He knows that Cecile has made up her mind to tell me everything, to hand over the letters to me. Dare he take the risk of going up to the 5th floor, right then, in the middle of the night, to forestall? You must have had a rough night of it, Dandurand. Dandurand did not flinch. On the contrary, he responded with his usual bleak, fleeting smile. Early next morning, while the concierge is out in the yard with her garbage cans, the brother and sister creep downstairs. Dandurand, his door open a crack, sees them go by. If only Cecile were by herself. But he couldn't tackle two people at once. Out in the street, the brother and sister go their separate ways. Dandurand follows Cecile in the fog, hoping for a chance at least to snatch her bag and its incriminating contents. The streetcar is not the right place. Between Pont Saint-Michel and police headquarters, no opportunity arises. She is inside the building. She is going up the stairs. Can anything save Monsieur Charles now? But there is one thing on his side, time. It is not yet 8 o'clock. I'm still at home, and that morning, as it so happens, I decide, for no particular reason, except perhaps to save Paris in the fog, to walk to work. Meanwhile, Cecile is waiting for me in the room we call the aquarium. Dandurand, meanwhile, is lurking nearby. Forgive me, Chief Superintendent, but I feel obliged to repeat my question. Have you any proof? Have you any witnesses? I have here in front of me, Maître Ponchard, a list of everyone who entered this building in the morning in question, and I see that there are at least 3 names. You, who are, in a sense, one of us, must surely understand it would have been much too risky for Dandurand to go up and speak to Cecile himself. Knowing all there was to know, nothing on earth would have persuaded her to go anywhere with him. But as luck would have it, who should turn up just then at police headquarters but a shady youth, a member of that very fraternity of which Monsieur Charles had established himself as a leading light. Dandurand accosts him eagerly. Hi there, there's a wench up there waiting to see the chief superintendent, and she's got to be stopped. It's absolutely essential that I should have a word with her. She doesn't know you. Bear in mind that Dandurand knows his way about the corridors of this building and those of the Palais de Justice as well as we do. Think of some excuse to bring her to me. I'll be waiting beyond the glass door, that. And that, gentlemen, is the only way it could have been managed. Needless to say, the accomplice had no notion that a murder was about to be committed, or he would have been reluctant, I assume, to do as he was asked, and I'm quite sure he's regretted it since. And so the drama unfolds. Do you wish to see Chief Superintendent Maigret? Cecile has just seen me go past. She is waiting. Unsuspectingly, she follows the spurious messenger. He leads her through the glass door. You'd be wise to admit that that's how it happened, Dandurand, because it is the only way it could have happened. At the sight of you, she is terrified. The broom closet is close at hand. You push her. She struggles. You try to grab her bag, but she clings to it. You strike her, and then... All this is pure conjecture, Chief Superintendent. The lawyer, who had been making copious notes, had lost none of his composure. After all, in such cases, it is not the lawyer's neck that is in jeopardy. And then, directing an almost imperceptible wink at his transatlantic colleague, Maigret murmured, "Would a letter meet the case? A letter from the man who took Cecile to my client. A letter from your client himself, my dear Maître." Dandurand's expression was steely. "Show it to me, then. I'm waiting." "And I," sighed Maigret, "am waiting for it to be found." In other words, all this is... Pure conjecture, yes, I'm afraid so. All the same, Monsieur Charles did slip away from me and go into Juliette's bedroom, and he must have had a reason for doing so. I have instituted a thorough search of the room. I don't know if you're familiar with the workings of an old woman's mind. Old women, as a class, tend to be deeply suspicious. Even though she did keep most of the letters in her desk, you can take it from me that... Monsieur Dandurand sniggered. They all stared at him. At this point, if the truth were told, Maigret was very close to admitting defeat. He had only one shred of hope to cling to. Had not Juliette Boynet said in one of her letters to Morphy that if any mishap should befall her, the chief superintendent had staked his all on this. He still refused to believe that during those few minutes alone in the bedroom, Dandurand had, the very fact that he had gone into that room, lifted the lid of the tapestry stool and touched the bundles of bills, even at the risk of leaving fingerprints, and yet had not taken them, must surely mean that he had been looking for something else, which was even more important to him. Was it conceivable that the old woman had been so foolish as to keep so crucial a document in the apartment where he could find it? And what if Maître Leloup had failed to telegraph to Morphy? What if Morphy had gone off fishing or shooting or whatever? What if he were anywhere but at home? If the telephone rang, Maigret quite literally leaped upon the instrument. Hello, yes, very well, keep trying. As he replaced the receiver, try as he might to conceal the fact, his face told Spencer Oats more plainly than words that the search in the apartment at Berger had yielded nothing. Permit me to point out, Chief Superintendent. You can point out anything you wish. As things are, your entire case rests upon a non-existent letter, and in these circumstances, as you know, my client has the right to. The telephone rang again. Hello. Very well. 3 or 4 hours? Yes, he's here. I'll tell him. And turning to Gerhard, you'd better go to your wife. I don't think it will be long now before you're a father. I repeat, Chief Superintendent, that Maigret gave the lawyer a look, but said nothing. Then he turned to the American, winked, and went out with him into the corridor. It's beginning to look, he said, as if this case in which you have been so good as to take an interest will end by making me look an awful fool, and you will go back to the United States with a very poor impression of my methods. All the same, I'm certain, absolutely certain, do you see, that... And then abruptly and without preamble, Maigret interrupted himself. What do you say to a beer? He hustled his companion out. In passing, he looked broodingly into the aquarium, where 2 or 3 people were waiting. They walked along in the shadow of the Palais de Justice and went into the Brasserie Dauphine, which was quiet and warm and redolent of draft beer. 2 beers, bumpers. What's a bumper? Asked the American. It's a special glass reserved for regulars. It holds a full liter. Somewhat inflated, they retraced the steps. I could swear. Oh well, never mind. If I have to start again from scratch, so be it. Spencer Oats was in a state of embarrassment felt by a man who attempts to express condolences without resorting to outworn phrases. Do you understand? Psychologically speaking, I know I'm right. It isn't possible that... What if Dandurand got to the letter first? Show me the lover that can match his mistress in cunning, retorted the chief superintendent, and old Juliette. They went up the dusty staircase, patterned with damp footprints. A man came up to them, self-important and very much on his dignity, carrying a briefcase. I trust you have some explanation, Chief Superintendent. Maigret had disliked Maître Leloup on sight. Now he fell upon him as if he were a dear friend whom he had not seen for 20 years. The telegram, why didn't he address it to me direct? Come on, hand it over. Here it is, but I doubt if you'll be able to make anything of it, and I'm not sure I ought to let you have it, unless you are prepared to tell me more. Maigret snatched the telegram out of his hand. Inform Chief Superintendent Maigret portrait photograph. Only present received from late aunt. Dismantled frame on off chance. Found concealed letter somewhat cryptic but in my opinion highly damaging to third party. Situation regarding succession completely altered since Joseph Boynet's death, not due to natural causes, and murderer and accomplice cannot inherit. Desirous of doing my duty but without prejudice, arriving Paris tonight. Etienne Monfils. Don't you think my client, ventured the lawyer. Your client is the hero of the house, Maître Leloup. He raises a point that I hadn't even thought of. Once it is established that Juliette Boynet was murdered by his wife and her lover, she is retrospectively dispossessed of his fortune, which referred to the Boynets and the Maigret. But the chief superintendent was no longer listening. He stood motionless in the middle of the vast corridor of police headquarters, within sight of the door of his own office. Close by was the glass-walled waiting room in which, one foggy morning, the child was in process of being born somewhere or other, little dreaming that the fees for his delivery would be paid by a small band of gentlemen whose fingers were adorned with flashy rings, and they, for their part, were no doubt engaged, at this hour, in the complexities of a game of billiard at Chez Albert on Rue Blanche. And what of Monsieur Charles, closeted with his lawyer under the discreet eye of the benign Torrence? What was he thinking? Not a bad idea. He was startled by the sound of his own voice, and he was not alone in this. Spencer Oats and Maître Leloup, taken unawares, nearly jumped out of their skins. I was thinking of that dodge with the photograph, he explained apologetically. The old woman sized up her cousin pretty accurately. She understood provincial life. Well, gentlemen, back to work. And with a little snort, he embarked upon the interrogation of all those who had visited police headquarters on the morning of the murder. He finished with the last of them, a small-time pimp, at 1 o'clock in the morning. In conclusion, dropping his burned-out cigarette on the floor, the man said, "Well, there it is. I tried to do someone a favor, and I land myself in the soup. What's the best I can hope for, Chief Superintendent? 2 years?" Madame Maigret had already been on the telephone 3 times. "Hello? No, don't wait for me. I'll probably be home pretty late." Suddenly, he had a craving for a plate of choucroute garni in the brasserie in Montmartre or Montparnasse, in company with his American. Afterward, they saw one another home, and weaving from bar to bar and from beer to beer, they drank the night away. After all, it was only fair that Spencer Oats should have something to talk about when he got back to Philadelphia. All the same, if it had not occurred to Monfils to take the photograph out of its frame. News-sur-Mer, Charente-Maritime, winter 1939-1940. Fontenay-le-Comte, Vendée, December 1940.
Accost. Accost. Verb. Approach and address someone boldly or aggressively. Spurious. Spurious. Adjective. Not being what it purports to be, false or fake. Regulant. Regulant. Adjective. Strongly reminiscent or suggestive of, fragrant or sweet smelling.